The morning of June 15, 1944 dawned gray and humid over the Central Pacific, where Task Force 58 stretched across the horizon like a steel constellation of American naval power. Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge of USS Indianapolis, watching the final preparations for Operation Forager, the assault on Saipan that would bring American forces within B-29 bombing range of the Japanese home islands. What Spruance didn't know, as he observed the 535 ships of his invasion fleet maneuvering into position, was that he was about to witness the bloodiest amphibious assault in Pacific War history, a battle that would cost more American lives than Guadalcanal and Tarawa combined. 15 miles ahead lay Saipan, a volcanic island 14 miles long and 5 miles wide, defended by 31,000 Japanese troops under Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito. The island's strategic importance was beyond calculation. From Saipan's airfields, Boeing B-29 Superfortresses could reach Tokyo, Osaka, and every major industrial center in Japan. The Japanese understood this as clearly as the Americans. Emperor Hirohito himself had declared that Saipan must be held at all costs, even if it meant the death of every defender. At 0542 hours, the pre-invasion bombardment began. 7 battleships of Task Force 58, including USS California and USS Tennessee, opened fire with their 14-inch and 16-inch guns, hurling shells weighing up to 2,700 pounds into the Japanese defensive positions. The sound was unlike anything in human experience, a rolling thunder that could be heard 50 miles away and shook the water around the fleet like an earthquake. For 2 hours, 165,000 rounds of naval gunfire pulverized the island's beaches and suspected strong points. Colonel Harry Schmidt, commanding the 4th Marine Division, watched the bombardment from the deck of transport USS Cavalier and felt the familiar mixture of confidence and dread that preceded every amphibious assault. Schmidt had led Marines at Roy Namur and Kwajalein, but Saipan was different. Intelligence estimates suggested the Japanese garrison was 3 times larger than previously encountered, and aerial reconnaissance had revealed defensive positions of unprecedented sophistication. "General, we're looking at something we've never seen before," Major James Roosevelt, the division intelligence officer, reported to Schmidt as they studied the latest aerial photographs. "The Japanese have had 2 years to fortify this island. They've got concrete bunkers, interlocking fields of fire, and artillery positions that can cover every inch of the beaches. This isn't going to be another Tarawa. This is going to be worse." At 0843 hours, the first wave of landing vehicle-tracked amphibious assault vehicles crossed the line of departure, carrying 8,000 Marines of the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions toward the beaches of Saipan. The LVTs, nicknamed Amtraks by their crews, could carry 20 fully equipped Marines across the coral reef that surrounded the island, delivering them directly onto the beach without the need for smaller landing craft. It was the largest amphibious assault in Pacific War history, and it was heading directly into the most sophisticated defensive system the Japanese had yet constructed. Corporal William Hayes of the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, crouched in the cramped interior of LVT 327 as it churned through the Pacific swells toward the landing beaches. Hayes had survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa, but the approach to Saipan felt different. The naval bombardment had been the heaviest he'd ever witnessed, yet the island ahead showed few signs of damage. The palm trees still stood, the beaches looked intact, and there was an ominous absence of secondary explosions that usually indicated ammunition dumps and fuel depots being destroyed. "Something's not right," Hayes muttered to Private First Class Robert Murphy, who was checking his M1 Garand rifle for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. "That bombardment should have leveled everything on that island, but it looks like we barely scratched the paint. Either our intelligence is completely wrong about the Japanese strength, or they're dug in deeper than we thought." At 0900 hours, the first LVTs reached the reef line surrounding Saipan and began their final approach to the landing beaches. The Marines had been told to expect heavy resistance at the water's edge, but the beaches appeared deserted. No enemy fire met the assault waves as they ground up onto the sand. For the first few minutes, it seemed that the massive pre-invasion bombardment had achieved its objective of neutralizing the Japanese defenders. Then the trap was sprung. At 0917 hours, as nearly 4,000 Marines had landed and were advancing inland from the beaches, The Japanese opened fire from concealed positions that had survived the naval bombardment. Machine gun nests built into coral caves swept the beaches with interlocking fields of fire. Artillery pieces, hidden in concrete bunkers and camouflaged positions, began dropping shells among the advancing Marines with devastating accuracy. The 2nd Marine Division, landing on the northern beaches, immediately encountered the 135th Infantry Regiment, dug into positions that had been prepared for over a year. These weren't the hastily constructed defenses that Marines had encountered on previous islands. The Japanese had used reinforced concrete, steel plate armor, and natural coral formations to create defensive positions that could withstand direct hits from 16-inch naval guns. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 1st Battalion, 8th Marines, led his squad inland from Beach Red 2 and immediately came under fire from a Japanese strongpoint that didn't appear on any intelligence map. "They've got a bunker complex about 200 yards inland," he reported over his radio to battalion headquarters. "Looks like it's built right into the coral ridgeline. We're taking heavy casualties trying to advance." The Japanese defensive strategy on Saipan represented a fundamental change in their approach to island warfare. Instead of defending at the water's edge, where naval gunfire could destroy them, they had withdrawn to prepared positions inland and allowed the Americans to land before opening fire. It was a tactical innovation that turned every advance into a costly assault against fortified positions. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, established his command post on Beach Red 2 at 1,100 hours and immediately realized that the assault was not proceeding according to plan. Instead of the rapid advance inland that had characterized previous amphibious operations, his Marines were pinned down in a series of costly firefights against an enemy that seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "We're facing a completely different kind of defense," Smith reported to Admiral Spruance via radio. "The Japanese have let us land, but now they're fighting for every yard of ground. Our casualties are already higher than anticipated, and we haven't even reached the first phase line. We're going to need everything we've got to take this island." The 4th Marine Division, landing on the southern beaches, encountered equally fierce resistance. The Japanese 43rd Division, commanded by Major General Saito, had positioned itself in depth across the island's southern approaches. Every coral ridge, every patch of jungle, every village had been turned into a fortress. The Marines found themselves fighting not for beaches or airfields, but for individual buildings, caves, and even single trees. Private First Class David Martinez of the 3rd Battalion, 25th Marines, advanced through the ruins of Charan-Kanoa village and discovered that the Japanese had turned every structure into a fighting position. "They've got shooters in the basements, snipers in the upper floors, and machine gun nests in the rubble," he reported to his squad leader. "We're having to clear every building room by room. This isn't an amphibious assault anymore. This is urban warfare." By 1400 hours on June 15th, it had become clear that Operation Forager was not going to be the swift victory that American planners had anticipated. Despite landing 20,000 Marines and establishing a beachhead 3 miles wide and nearly a mile deep, the assault forces had failed to capture any of their primary objectives. Slido Airfield, the main prize on the southern part of the island, remained in Japanese hands. The high ground overlooking the beaches was still occupied by enemy artillery observers who could direct accurate fire on the landing areas. The Japanese defense was being coordinated with a level of sophistication that surprised American commanders. Instead of the banzai charges that had characterized earlier battles, the Japanese were conducting a methodical fighting withdrawal, making the Americans pay in blood for every advance while preserving their own forces for the decisive battles to come. Colonel Takashi Takashina, commanding the Japanese 135th Infantry Regiment, had studied American amphibious tactics and developed countermeasures that exploited every weakness in the Marine Corps doctrine. His men were positioned in mutually supporting strong points that could provide covering fire for each other. When one position became untenable, the defenders would withdraw to the next prepared position, forcing the Americans to begin the assault process all over again. "The Americans rely on their naval gunfire and air support," Takashina explained to his battalion commanders during a planning conference held in a reinforced bunker complex. "But they cannot use those weapons effectively against defenders who are mixed in with their own troops. We will draw them into close combat where their technological advantages are neutralized, and Japanese spirit can prevail. As the first day of the battle drew to a close, both sides prepared for what would clearly be a prolonged and bloody campaign. American casualties on June 15 totaled over 2,000 killed and wounded, far higher than the losses sustained in the initial assault on any previous Pacific island. The Japanese, despite fighting from prepared positions, had also suffered heavily. Entire companies had been wiped out defending their assigned sectors, but their sacrifice had bought time for the main defensive line to be reinforced. The night of June 15th to 16th brought no relief for either side. Japanese infiltration tactics, perfected during 3 years of jungle warfare, turned the American perimeter into a shooting gallery. Small groups of Japanese soldiers, armed with grenades and explosive charges, penetrated the marine lines and attacked command posts, supply dumps, and artillery positions. The constant threat of night attacks meant that no American position was truly secure, and exhausted Marines had to maintain full alert throughout the hours of darkness. Corporal Hayes, now serving as acting squad leader after his sergeant was killed during the afternoon advance, positioned his men in a defensive perimeter around a captured Japanese pillbox. "Nobody sleeps tonight," he told his Marines. "The Japanese are going to try to infiltrate our lines, and they're damn good at it. Every shadow, every sound could be the enemy. Stay alert or we're all going home in body bags." The second day of the battle, June 16th, began with a Japanese counterattack designed to drive the Marines back into the sea. At 0500 hours, elements of the Japanese 9th Tank Regiment, supported by infantry from the 136th Infantry Regiment, launched a coordinated assault against the American beachhead. The attack was spearheaded by Type 97 Chiha medium tanks, each mounting a 47mm gun and carrying a crew of 4 men who had sworn to die rather than retreat. The tank attack caught the Marines by surprise. American intelligence had not detected the presence of armored units on Saipan, and the Marines' anti-tank defenses were positioned to cover the beaches rather than the inland approaches. The Japanese tanks broke through the perimeter at several points, threatening to split the American forces and isolate entire battalions. Lieutenant Robert Thompson, commanding a platoon of the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, found himself directly in the path of the Japanese armor. "We've got tanks coming up the coastal road," he reported over his radio. "At least 8 of them with infantry support. We need bazooka teams up here right now, or they're going to roll right through us." The Marine Corps had learned hard lessons about tank warfare during the Guadalcanal campaign, and every rifle company now included bazooka teams trained specifically to engage enemy armor. But the Japanese tanks on Saipan were being used differently than American planners had anticipated. Instead of charging directly at American positions, they were providing mobile fire support for infantry attacks, using their armor protection to get close enough to Marine positions to deliver accurate cannon fire. Private First Class Murphy, carrying one of the new M1A1 bazooka rocket launchers, crawled forward through the undergrowth to get within range of the lead Japanese tank. The 236-inch rocket had been designed to penetrate the armor of German tanks in Europe, but intelligence on Japanese tank armor was limited. Murphy would have to get within 100 yards of his target to ensure a kill, close enough for the tank's machine guns to cut him down if he missed. The Japanese tank commander, Sergeant Hiroshi Yamamoto, had been fighting American forces since the invasion of the Philippines in 1941. His Type 97 tank was obsolete by 1944 standards, but Yamamoto understood that armor tactics in jungle warfare were about mobility and fire support rather than tank versus tank duels. His mission was to provide covering fire for the infantry assault, not to engage in a technological battle he couldn't win. At 75 yards, Murphy fired his bazooka. The rocket struck the Japanese tank's turret at an oblique angle, penetrating the thin armor and detonating inside the fighting compartment. The explosion killed Yamamoto and his crew instantly, but their sacrifice had allowed the supporting infantry to close within grenade range of the Marine positions. The tank attack had failed, but it had cost the Americans valuable time and irreplaceable men. By noon on June 16th, the Japanese counterattack had been repelled, but the cost to both sides was enormous. The Marines had lost nearly 500 additional casualties, while the Japanese tank regiment had ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. More importantly for the Japanese, the counterattack had delayed the American advance by at least 24 hours, giving the defenders more time to prepare their main defensive line across the island's mountainous interior. General Saito, commanding the Japanese garrison, understood that the tank attack had been a calculated gamble that had partially succeeded. His forces could not defeat the Americans in a conventional battle, but they could make the conquest of Saipan so costly that American public opinion might force a negotiated peace. Every day that Saipan held out was another day for Japanese diplomats to seek intervention by neutral powers. "We cannot win this battle in the traditional sense," Saito explained to his staff officers during a conference in the underground command bunker at Mount Tapachau. "But we can make the Americans pay such a price for victory that they will think twice before attempting to invade the home islands. Every Marine who dies on Saipan is one less Marine who will assault the beaches of Japan." The third day of the battle, June 17th, saw the Americans begin their systematic advance across the island's southern portion. The 4th Marine Division, reinforced by elements of the 27th Infantry Division, began the slow and costly process of reducing the Japanese defensive positions one by one. Each bunker, each cave, each fortified village required a separate assault, coordinated between infantry, engineers, and supporting artillery. The fighting technique that emerged on Saipan would become the template for the rest of the Pacific War. Marine infantry would locate and fix Japanese positions, combat engineers would move forward with flamethrowers and demolition charges to neutralize the defenders, and artillery would provide covering fire to prevent Japanese reinforcements from intervening. It was methodical, professional, and extraordinarily deadly for both sides. Sergeant First Class Antonio Rodriguez, a combat engineer with the 4th Marine Division, specialized in bunker demolition. His team carried 40-pound charges of TNT, along with portable flamethrowers that could reach into cave systems where explosive charges might not be effective. Rodriguez had been fighting in the Pacific for 18 months, and he understood that jungle warfare was fundamentally different from the conventional battles being fought in Europe. "In Europe, you fight for towns and bridges and road junctions," Rodriguez explained to a replacement engineer who had just arrived from the States. "Out here, you fight for individual holes in the ground. Every Japanese position has to be taken separately, and they're all connected by tunnels and communication trenches that don't show up on any map. You clear one bunker, and 10 minutes later the Japanese are back, because they came up through a tunnel you didn't know existed." The Japanese defensive system on Saipan had been designed by Colonel Hideki Tojo, Jr., son of the Japanese Prime Minister, who had studied German defensive tactics on the Eastern Front. The positions were built in depth, with multiple fallback lines that could continue to function even after the forward positions had been overrun. Supply tunnels, communication trenches, and underground hospitals allowed the defenders to sustain their resistance even when completely surrounded. By June 20th, the American forces had advanced barely 3 miles inland from the landing beaches, far behind the schedule established in the pre-invasion planning. The Japanese had traded space for time, conducting a fighting withdrawal that inflicted maximum casualties on the attackers while preserving their own strength for the final defensive battles. American casualties had already exceeded 4,000 killed and wounded, with no end to the fighting in sight. Admiral Spruance, under pressure from Washington to accelerate the pace of operations, authorized the use of napalm against Japanese positions for the first time in the Pacific War. The new incendiary weapon, developed specifically for use against fortified positions, could penetrate cave systems and bunkers that were immune to conventional explosives. But napalm was a double-edged weapon that could kill American troops as easily as Japanese if the wind shifted at the wrong moment. The first napalm attack was launched on June 21st against a Japanese strongpoint that had held up the advance of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, for 3 days. Carrier aircraft from USS Enterprise and USS Lexington dropped 500-pound napalm bombs on the target area, creating a firestorm that could be seen from the landing beaches. The attack was devastatingly effective, but it also provided a preview of the kind of warfare that would characterize the final phase of the Pacific conflict. Captain James Wilson, commanding Company F of the 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, watched the napalm attack from a position 500 yards away and realized that warfare had entered a new phase. "We're not just fighting for military objectives anymore," he told his company first sergeant. "We're fighting to exterminate an entire garrison. There's no quarter asked and none given. This is going to be a war of annihilation." The Japanese response to the escalating American firepower was to dig deeper and fight harder. Saito ordered his men to construct a final defensive line across the island's mountainous spine, using the natural caves and rock formations to create positions that could withstand even direct hits from 16-inch naval guns. The defenders understood that they were fighting a delaying action, but they were determined to make the Americans pay the highest possible price for every mile of ground. Lieutenant Colonel Takashi Hirakushi, commanding the Japanese 1st Battalion, 18th Infantry Regiment, positioned his men in the caves and ravines around Mount Tapachau, the island's highest point. From these positions, his troops could observe American movements across the entire southern half of the island and direct artillery fire with devastating accuracy. More importantly, the mountain positions were virtually immune to naval gunfire and air attack. "The Americans depend on their superior firepower," Hirakushi explained to his company commanders. "But firepower is useless if it cannot reach the target. From these positions, we can hold out indefinitely, and every day we delay the American advance is a victory for the Emperor and the Japanese people." As June drew to a close, both sides prepared for the climactic phase of the Saipan campaign. The Americans had established control over the southern third of the island, including the crucial Hirohito airfield, which was already being prepared for B-29 operations against Japan. But the cost had been enormous. Over 6,000 American casualties in just 2 weeks of fighting, with the most difficult battles still ahead. The Japanese, despite losing nearly half their original garrison, had successfully delayed the American advance and inflicted casualties at a rate that exceeded even the bloodiest battles of the European theater. Their defensive strategy had transformed Saipan from a strategic objective into a test of American willingness to accept massive casualties in pursuit of victory. General Smith, reviewing casualty reports in his command post, realized that the Saipan campaign had become something unprecedented in American military history. "We're looking at casualty rates that exceed anything we've experienced in this war," he reported to Admiral Spruance. "If we have to fight like this for every island between here and Japan, the American people may not have the stomach for it." What Smith didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. The Japanese had prepared their most formidable defenses in the island's mountainous interior, where American technological advantages would be minimized and the battle would be decided by individual courage and determination. The fighting for Mount Tapachau and the northern end of the island would make the previous 2 weeks look like a skirmish. On July 1, 1944, the American forces began their advance toward the Japanese main defensive line. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, reinforced by the entire 27th Infantry Division, launched a coordinated assault against positions that had been prepared for over a year. The attack was supported by the heaviest concentration of naval gunfire and air support yet assembled in the Pacific War, but the Japanese defenders were ready. The battle for Saipan's interior began with a preliminary bombardment that lasted 6 hours and expended over 200,000 rounds of naval artillery. The sound was audible in Japan, over 1,500 miles away, and the explosion flashes could be seen from ships 50 miles at sea. When the bombardment ended and American troops advanced toward the Japanese positions, they discovered that the massive firepower had barely scratched the enemy defenses. Private First Class Murphy, now a squad leader after 3 weeks of combat, led his men up the slopes of Mount Tapachau and immediately came under fire from positions that showed no signs of damage from the bombardment. "They've got bunkers built right into the rock," he reported over his radio. "Our artillery didn't even chip the paint. We're going to have to take every position by hand, and they're making us pay for every yard." The fighting in Saipan's mountains combined the worst aspects of jungle warfare with the technological challenges of modern combat. American troops had to advance uphill against an enemy that had perfect observation and interlocking fields of fire. Every ravine, every cave, every pile of rocks could conceal a machine gun nest or sniper position. Progress was measured in yards per day, and each yard cost lives that could never be replaced. Sergeant Rodriguez, the combat engineer, found himself at the center of the most difficult fighting. His job was to get close enough to Japanese positions to place demolition charges or use flamethrowers, work that required advancing under direct enemy fire across terrain that offered no cover or concealment. "It's like trying to attack a medieval castle," he explained to a war correspondent. "Except the defenders have machine guns and mortars instead of arrows and boiling oil." The Japanese defense of Mount Tapachau was commanded by Colonel Hirohito, who had transformed the mountain into a fortress that seemed impregnable to conventional assault. His positions were connected by a network of tunnels that allowed defenders to move unseen between bunkers. Supply corridors brought ammunition and food from hidden depots, and underground hospitals treated wounded defenders without exposing them to American fire. "We have turned this mountain into a fortress that will break the American spirit," Hirohito reported to General Saito. "Every position they take costs them dozens of casualties, and we can hold these positions indefinitely. Let them exhaust themselves against our defenses. Time is on our side." But time was not on the Japanese side. Despite their tactical successes, the strategic situation was hopeless. American forces controlled the sea approaches to Saipan, preventing any possibility of reinforcement or evacuation. More importantly, the fall of Saipan would bring American B-29 bombers within range of Japan's industrial heartland, a development that would fundamentally alter the strategic balance of the Pacific War. On July 7, 1944, General Saito made the decision that would define the final phase of the Saipan campaign. Realizing that his forces could not hold out indefinitely, he ordered a final banzai charge designed to inflict maximum casualties on the American forces before the garrison was wiped out. It would be the largest Japanese suicide attack of the Pacific War, involving over 4,000 soldiers, sailors, and civilian volunteers. The banzai charge began at 0400 hours on July 7, as the remaining elements of the Japanese garrison launched a coordinated assault against American positions across the entire northern end of the island. The attackers came in waves, armed with rifles, swords, bamboo spears, and even bare hands. Their objective was not victory in any conventional sense, but death with honor and maximum damage to the enemy. The American forces, exhausted by 3 weeks of continuous combat, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against an enemy that seemed to have risen from the dead. The Japanese attackers showed no regard for casualties, advancing into machine gun fire with the kind of fanatical determination that American troops had never encountered in any previous war. Lieutenant Thompson, commanding the remnants of his platoon from the 2nd Battalion, 6th Marines, found himself directly in the path of the Japanese assault. "They just kept coming," he later reported. "We cut them down by the hundreds, but they kept coming. It was like fighting against a tidal wave of human beings who had decided that death was preferable to surrender." The banzai charge continued for over 6 hours, with Japanese attackers throwing themselves against American positions with complete disregard for tactical logic or personal survival. Many of the attackers were wounded men who had crawled from field hospitals to participate in the final assault. Others were civilian volunteers who had chosen death over capture. The carnage was unlike anything in military history. When the attack finally ended, over 4,300 Japanese were dead, including General Saito and most of his staff officers. American casualties were also severe, with over 900 killed and wounded in a single morning. But the Japanese garrison had effectively ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. The Battle of Saipan was over, but the cost had been beyond anything previously experienced in the Pacific War. The final casualty count for the Saipan campaign was staggering: 3,426 Americans killed and 13,099 wounded, for a total of over 16,500 casualties. Japanese losses were even more severe: approximately 27,000 military personnel killed, along with an estimated 22,000 civilian deaths. The island had been transformed into a graveyard that would serve as a preview of the battles to come as American forces moved closer to the Japanese home islands. Admiral Spruance, surveying the devastation from the deck of USS Indianapolis, realized that the Pacific War had entered a new phase. The Japanese were no longer fighting to win in any conventional sense. They were fighting to make the cost of American victory so high that the United States would seek a negotiated peace rather than continue the advance toward Japan. It was a strategy based on the calculation that American democracy could not sustain the casualties that would be required to conquer the Japanese Empire. "We've won Saipan," Spruance reported to Admiral Nimitz, "but the cost has been higher than anyone anticipated. If we have to fight like this for every island between here and Japan, we're looking at casualties that could reach into the hundreds of thousands. The American people may not be willing to pay that price." The strategic consequences of the Saipan campaign extended far beyond the immediate military objectives. The island's capture brought Japan within range of American B-29 bombers, beginning the strategic bombing campaign that would devastate Japanese cities and industries. More importantly, the ferocity of Japanese resistance on Saipan convinced American planners that the invasion of Japan itself would require casualties on a scale that was politically and militarily unacceptable. The lessons learned on Saipan would influence every subsequent American operation in the Pacific. The Japanese had demonstrated that they would fight to the death for every strategic position, and that technological superiority alone was not sufficient to guarantee quick victory. American forces would have to be prepared for prolonged, costly campaigns that would test not only military capability but also national resolve. For the Marines and soldiers who survived the Saipan campaign, the battle had taught them that the Pacific War was fundamentally different from the conflict being fought in Europe. This was not a war between professional armies fighting for limited political objectives. It was a war between entire civilizations, where surrender was not an option and victory could only be achieved through the complete destruction of the enemy's will to resist. The Battle of Saipan established the pattern that would characterize the final phase of the Pacific War: American technological superiority and industrial capacity against Japanese fanaticism and willingness to accept unlimited casualties. It was a contest that would ultimately be decided not by military skill or strategic brilliance, but by each side's ability to sustain losses that exceeded anything in previous military history. In the months that followed, American B-29 bombers based on Saipan would begin the systematic destruction of Japanese industrial capacity, while American forces prepared for the even bloodier campaigns that lay ahead at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But for the men who had fought in the coral caves and volcanic ridges of Saipan, the war had already taught them its most important lesson: that victory in the Pacific would be measured not in strategic objectives captured or battles won, but in the willingness to continue fighting when the cost seemed beyond human endurance. The island of Saipan, transformed from a tropical paradise into a landscape of death and destruction, would serve as a memorial to the price of victory in the Pacific War. This capture had been necessary for the strategic defeat of Japan, but the cost had been so high that it forced American leaders to seek alternatives to conventional invasion. The atomic bombs that would end the war 13 months later were, in many ways, a direct consequence of the lessons learned in the bloody Coral of Saipan. For the families of the 16,500 American casualties, the strategic significance of the victory was less important than the personal loss that could never be recovered. They had paid the ultimate price for their country's advance toward victory, and their sacrifice would be remembered long after the strategic importance of Saipan had been forgotten by all but military historians. The war would go on, as wars always do, until one side could no longer continue fighting. But June 15, 1944 would be remembered as the day when America learned the true cost of victory in the Pacific and discovered that some battles, however necessary, exact a price that can never be fully calculated or completely justified.